The first month was a study in quiet discovery, conducted in the hushed cathedral of Lucian's personal library. It was a world of vellum and ink, of light moated with the dust of forgotten centuries, and it was there that Sarah found him, or perhaps where they found each other. He was not a king in that room. He was merely a curator of quiet things, his long fingers tracing the faded gilt on the spine of a book with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the sharp, predatory grace of his form. Sarah, who had been hired to catalogue the castle's extensive collection of pre-human cartography, moved through the shelves like a careful ghost, her own love for the fragile permanence of paper a silent, resonant hum in the air between them. She was young by their kind's reckoning, barely a century turned, and she still carried the wide-eyed wonder of someone for whom eternity was a fresh, thrilling gift rather than a burden. Their conversations began as whispers about provenance and preservation, the shared language of those who respected the past. He would find her perched on a rolling ladder, lost in a 16th-century celestial map, and would stand at the bottom, not speaking, simply watching until she sensed his presence. She would look down, her pale, luminous features catching the lamplight, and he would offer a small, rare smile that felt like a secret entrusted only to her. "The cartographer went mad," he said one afternoon, his voice a low counterpoint to the distant chime of a clock. He pointed to a swirl of ink in the corner of the map she was examining, a place where the known world dissolved into a maelstrom of sea monsters and cryptic warnings. Believed he'd charted the geography of a god's dream. He was institutionalized, of course. They said the work drove him to it. Sarah traced the kraken's tentacle with her fingertip, her touch leaving no warmth on the ancient paper. "Or maybe he just saw something true," she murmured, and no one else was brave enough to look. Lucian's gaze was not on the map, but on her face, on the soft, earnest curve of her mouth. It was in moments like these that the air grew thick with unspoken things. It was in the way he began bringing her cups of tea, dark and fragrant, leaving them on the edge of her work table without a word. It was in the way she started leaving out books for him she thought he might enjoy, open to a particular passage, a silent offering of her own. They learned the topography of each other's minds before they ever dared to breach the space between their bodies. The second month, the space began to shrink. It happened accidentally at first. A shared reach for the same leather-bound folio, their hands brushing. The contact was electric, a jolt of impossible recognition that lingered long after they drew back. Lucian's composure, the ancient, carefully constructed stillness of a monarch, fractured for a barest second. He saw not just her hand, but the elegant line of her wrist, the delicate strength in her fingers, the faint dusting of archival powder on her knuckles. He felt an urge so fierce and protective it stole the air from his lungs. He wanted to fold her hand into his and never let it go. Later that week, he found her in deep rest, slumped over a desk with her cheek pillowed on an open atlas of lost cities. The moonlight from the tall, arched window painted her in silver, her stillness so complete she might have been carved from marble. Her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, spilling like dark silk over the faded coast of a phantom continent. He stood there for what felt like an hour, simply watching her. The instinct to rule, to command, to possess, was a vestige of his bloodline he'd always kept in check. But this was different. This was not a desire to own, but to shelter. He carefully lifted a heavy velvet throw from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders, his movements so slow, so deliberate, they were almost reverent. He allowed his fingers to graze her hair, a touch as light as a moth's wing, and a warmth bloomed in the frozen center of his chest, a feeling he hadn't known existed. It was terrifying. It was exquisite. By the third month, the silence between them had become as eloquent as poetry. They no longer needed to speak of maps or books. They would sit in the deep armchairs by the fire, as the autumn rains lashed against the stained glass, reading their separate volumes, the only sound the soft turn of a page and the crackle of the logs. But the quiet was a living thing, a shared atmosphere of profound, deepening connection. He would look up and find her watching him, her expression soft and full of a light that made him feel seen in a way he never had been. Not as a king, not as a predator, but as a man who loved old books and the company of a quiet woman. He was falling, not in a sudden, violent plummet, but in a slow, graceful spiral, and the terrifying part was that he was not fighting it. He was letting it happen. One evening, she read a line of poetry aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "And I shall feel your heart's slow beat, and you shall feel mine." He looked at her, across the small pool of firelight that separated them, and the truth of it was a physical blow. He did feel it. He felt the rhythm of her presence in his own ancient, still heart. He saw his entire, endless future narrowing to a single point of light, and that light was her. It was love. He knew it, with a certainty that shook the foundations of his world. And in that same moment, a cold shadow fell over him, the ghost of his parents' ruinous, all-consuming passion. A bond that had started as a song and ended as a shriek. The warmth in his chest turned to ice. He wanted her more than he had ever wanted anything, and he was suddenly, mortally afraid of what that wanting could become. The realization struck him not as a gentle dawn, but as a bolt of lightning. It was a physical event, a cataclysm in the landscape of his soul. He was standing across the library from her, watching as she reshelved a heavy tome on the history of celestial navigation. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, igniting the dust motes into a swirling galaxy around her. She turned, catching his gaze, and offered him that small, private smile that had become the axis on which his world now tilted. And in that instant, it happened. A golden thread, luminous and shimmering, spooled out from the center of his being and slammed into her with the force of a physical impact. He felt her gasp, felt her stumble, as if she too had been struck. The bond, the fated, inescapable, legendary bond of a mated pair. It was real. It was her. For a single, glorious second, his entire existence sang with a joy so pure it was almost unbearable. Every part of him, every ancient, weary atom, recognized her as his completion, his harbor. The end of a loneliness so profound he hadn't even known its name until it was gone. He saw 1,000 futures with her in the space of a heartbeat, their hands entwined, their minds connected, an eternity of quiet moments just like this. Then the second came, and it brought the flood. The joy was washed away by a tidal wave of ice-cold terror. The golden thread in his mind's eye became a chain, then a leash, then the bars of a gilded cage. He saw his father, his face contorted in a mask of possessive rage, his voice a roar that shook the castle's foundations. He saw his mother, her eyes glittering with unshed tears and venom, using the bond as a weapon, twisting it to inflict the most intimate, unbearable pain. Their love, their fated connection, had not been a sanctuary, it had been a battlefield. They had adored and despised each other in equal, soul-shredding measure, their passion a magnificent, destructive fire that had consumed them both and scorched everyone who stood too near. Lucian had sworn, as a boy hiding from their storms, that he would never become that. He would rule alone for 10,000 years before he would ever put a woman, any woman, in that cage with him. And now, fate had delivered him the one woman he could ever truly love, and handed him the very same chains. The terror was absolute. It was a physical sickness that coiled in his gut. He looked at Sira, at her dear, familiar face now alight with a dawning, wondrous confusion, and all he could see was a victim. He could see himself turning into his father, his love curdling into obsession, his protection into possession. The adoration he felt for her right now felt like the seed of a future poison. He had to stop it. He had to slow it down. He couldn't let the fire burn that hot, that fast. It would destroy them. It would destroy her. He took a step back, the movement sharp, involuntary. The light in her eyes flickered, replaced by uncertainty. The golden thread between them pulsed with her sudden hurt. Sarah's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and bewilderment. "Lucian, what was that?" Her voice trembled. She had felt it too, the golden slam of connection, the sudden, overwhelming sense of him flooding into her consciousness. She'd heard stories of fated bonds, distant folklore whispered among their kind, but never imagined she would experience one. She was so young, barely a century old. These things were supposed to be rare, legendary, reserved for ancient pairs. Her immortal heart, which had learned to beat so slowly, now hammered with a mixture of wonder and fear. He saw the confusion and dawning hope warring in her face. This was the moment to explain, to tell her what had just happened, to take her hands and reassure her that they would navigate this together. To tell her he felt it too, that it was real, that she was everything. Instead, the terror choked him silent. The words wouldn't come. All he could see was the future burning. Lucian? Her voice was soft, questioning, and so achingly vulnerable it nearly broke him. He couldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't let her see the adoration and the terror warring within him. He had to build a wall, just for a little while. He needed time to think, to find a way to navigate this that wouldn't lead them to the same ruin. He needed to build a foundation of something solid, something other than this overwhelming, fated cataclysm. Friendship, trust, something that could temper the fire. He forced himself to speak, but the words came out wrong, clumsy and cold, stripped of all context of his inner turmoil. "Sira," he began, his voice strained, unfamiliar to his own ears. "What has been happening between us? It's been remarkable." He was trying for gentle, for careful. It sounded like dismissal. She was watching him, her face a mask of wounded stillness. "Yes," she whispered. And he could hear the hope in that single word, the terrible, fragile hope. He had to say it. He had to put a break on this runaway destiny, just for a moment. He thought if he could just reframe it, they could build from a safer place. "I value your presence here more than I can say," he said, the formal words tasting like ash. "And I hope that even as things change, we could still be friends." He saw the words hit her. It was like watching a pane of stained glass shatter in slow motion. The light, the color, the life in her eyes, it all just broke. The hope, the wonder, the dawning joy of the bond, it vanished, replaced by an expression of such profound, quiet devastation that it physically hurt him to see. He had meant it as a beginning, a clumsy plea to build something stronger than fate. "Let's start with friendship so we don't destroy each other." But what she heard was an ending, a rejection. He'd felt the bond that incredible, once in an eternity gift, and he'd looked at her, and said no. She wasn't enough. Or worse, she was too much, and he didn't want the burden. He saw his mistake in the ruin of her face, but the panic had him by the throat. He couldn't take it back. He could only stand there, a coward in his own library, as he broke the most precious thing he had ever found. The walk from the library to her assigned quarters was the longest of Sira's life. The castle corridors, once full of fascinating shadows and the comforting scent of old stone, now felt like a mausoleum. The air was thin, each breath a painful effort. The echo of his words followed her, a cruel, relentless whisper. "We could still be friends. Friends." The word was an obscenity. It was a polite, bloodless blade slid neatly between her ribs. After 3 months of shared silences that spoke volumes, of lingering looks that held entire conversations, of a connection so deep it felt elemental, and then the bond, the actual, mythical bond slamming into her like destiny itself. He offered her friendship. He'd felt what she felt. She knew he had, and he had turned away from it, from her. She reached her rooms and closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding as final as a tomb being sealed. She didn't cry. The pain was too sharp, too crystalline for tears. It was a shard of ice lodged in her chest, freezing her from the inside out. He had felt it too. She knew he had. The moment in the library, the golden shock that had passed between them that was real. It was the beginning of everything. And he had looked at that beginning and turned away. He had seen the potential for a universe between them and offered her a tiny, sterile room called friendship. She sat in the darkness for hours, numb and shaking, the bond still humming faintly in her chest, a constant reminder of what he didn't want. But as the shock faded, clarity came, sharp and cold as a knife. She would not stay. She would not be his friend. She would not haunt the edges of his life, a constant, pathetic reminder of what he had chosen not to want. Her pride, a quiet, but fiercely guarded thing, would not allow it. She would vanish. She would erase herself from his world so completely it would be as if she had never been. The memory came to her then, sharp and sudden. 3 weeks ago, she'd been in the village below the castle, wandering the narrow streets on her afternoon off. She'd passed a small curiosity shop, its windows cluttered with strange artifacts and occult trinkets. Something had pulled her inside an instinct she hadn't understood at the time. An ancient woman, Her face, a map of wrinkles, had looked up from behind the counter and simply stared at her. Without a word, she'd reached beneath the counter and withdrawn a small, silver pendant on a delicate chain shaped like a tightly closed lotus blossom. "For when love becomes a cage, child," the woman had said, her voice like dry leaves. "I see the castle in your future. I see the bond. You'll need this." Sarah had been unsettled, but the woman's certainty had been absolute. She'd purchased it, tucked it away, and tried to forget about it, until now. She retrieved it from the small wooden box where she'd hidden it, holding it up in the moonlight streaming through her window, a bond blocker. A rare and controversial piece of magic. Forbidden in many circles, it didn't destroy a bond, but it shrouded it, wrapped the wearer in a fog of anonymity that severed the telepathic and emotional connection. It turned the vibrant, life-altering link into a faint, static-filled whisper, easily ignored. More than that, it made the wearer forgettable, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Memories would blur, descriptions would fail. It was designed not just to hide a bond, but to hide the person entirely from supernatural searching. It was a desperate, brutal act, to willingly sever a part of her own soul. But the alternative to feel the constant, agonizing pull of him, to feel his presence in the castle, to sense him through the bond he didn't want, knowing he did not want her, was unthinkable. It would be a living death. This, at least, was a clean one. She began to pack, her movements methodical, numb. She looked at the small stack of books he had recommended, their pages filled with his marginalia. She left them. She saw the small, pressed wildflower he had picked for her from the castle gardens, tucked between the pages of her journal. She left it. She took only what she had arrived with: a few changes of clothes, a small purse of savings, and the hollowed-out ache in her chest. Each object she left behind was an act of severance, a cutting of the ties that had bound her to this place, to him. Finally, her bag was packed. Dawn was approaching. Her hands trembled as she lifted the chain over her head. The moment the cool silver touched her skin, she felt it. A sharp, surgical coldness spread through her chest. The golden thread that had so recently flared to life between her and Lucian was abruptly, violently cut. The sensation was sickening, a profound spiritual amputation. The glorious, terrifying sense of him that had filled every corner of her being was snuffed out, replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. The pain of the severing was sharp, but the numbness that followed was worse. It was the silence after the music has stopped. It was the color draining from the world. Clutching the pendant at her throat, a cold comfort against her skin, she picked up her bag. She didn't look back. She moved through the sleeping castle, a ghost shedding her own life, and slipped out through a small postern gate into the pre-dawn mist. By the time the sun rose over his kingdom, Sarah was already gone, a new name already forming on her lips, leaving nothing behind but a hollow space in a library and a king who had no idea he had just lost his entire world. Lucian let a day pass. He told himself it was for her. He'd seen the devastation on her face. She needed space to process his clumsy, ill-phrased words. He would give her that space, and then he would find her, and he would explain everything properly. He would tell her of his fears, of his parents, of his desperate desire to build something with her that was stronger than the violent whims of fate. He thought he was being patient. He thought he was being wise. He was a fool. The first inkling of wrongness was a subtle disquiet, a faint sense of imbalance in the world. The bond, which had blazed to life so brightly, was now muted, a dull, distant thrum where a symphony had been. He attributed it to her emotional distress, her pulling away. He reasoned it would return when he made things right. On the morning of the second day, the disquiet had grown into a gnawing void. The muted bond was no longer a thrum. It was a constant, hollow ache in the center of his chest. It felt like a phantom limb, a part of himself that had been amputated while he slept. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his misguided patience. He went to the library, expecting to find her there, her quiet presence a balm to his rising anxiety. The room was empty. The air was still and dead. A cup of tea he had brought her 2 days ago sat cold on her desk. He went to her quarters. He knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the heavy oak. There was no answer. He pushed the door open. The room was tidy, impersonal, and breathtakingly empty. The bed was made. The few books he'd given her were stacked neatly on the nightstand, but her bag was gone. Her cloak was gone. She was gone. It was the sight of the pressed wildflower, lying abandoned on her journal, that broke him. A small, fragile thing he had given her, discarded. It was a final, silent judgment. The panic became a cold, roaring fire. He searched the castle, his movements swift and silent, a predator on the hunt. He questioned the guards. Their reports were a series of hammer blows. A woman matching her description had left through the east gate. Before dawn. The previous day, she had been gone for nearly 48 hours. The muted ache in his chest now made a terrible, sickening sense. It wasn't just her emotional distance. She had done something. She had blocked him. She had severed them. The first month was a blur of frantic, impotent rage. He was the king, ancient and powerful, and he had been undone by a quiet cataloger of maps. He dispatched his most trusted scouts to every corner of the continent, with a description so detailed it bordered on the poetic. He gave them no name, only her face, the memory of which was already becoming a torment. But the reports that came back were maddening, nonsensical. I think I saw her, but when I looked again, the innkeeper couldn't quite remember her face. The description kept slipping from my mind, sire. I would stand in a town square, certain she was near, and then, nothing, just a feeling of emptiness. It was as if she'd become a ghost, impossible to pin down. Even his most detailed descriptions seemed to dissolve into vague impressions the moment his scouts tried to act on them. Whatever magic she had used, it was insidious. It worked through intermediaries, making her not invisible, but forgettable, irrelevant. Just another face in just another town. His court saw a new side of their king, not the reserved, contemplative ruler, but a cold, volatile tyrant. His temper was short, his judgments harsh. He was a man hollowed out by a ghost, and he made his entire kingdom feel the chill of her absence. By the 6-month mark, the rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of despair. He'd recalled his scouts. Their methods were useless against whatever shrouded her. If he was going to find her, he would have to do it himself. He largely abandoned his duties, leaving them to a council of trusted elders, and began to wander the world alone. He followed not rumors, but instinct, letting the muted, agonizing thread of the severed bond pull him like a dowsing rod toward water. It was faint, nearly imperceptible, a phantom sensation that might have been wishful thinking, but it was all he had. The kingdom began to suffer from his neglect. Treaties went unsigned, disputes festered, the careful order he had maintained for centuries began to fray at the edges. The castle itself seemed to mourn, the halls darker, the fires burning lower. Lucian barely noticed. He spent his nights in whatever forgotten corner of the world his search had taken him to, and let the silence scream at him. The hollow ache of the severed bond was his constant companion, a dull, unending punishment for a single, cowardly sentence. At the end of a year, he was a wraith. The frantic search had become a grim, methodical pilgrimage. He looked older, worn down not by centuries, but by 365 days of agonizing regret. He understood, now, the catastrophic scale of his error. He hadn't been buying time, he had been throwing it away. He had stood at the threshold of heaven and, in a moment of craven fear, had slammed the door shut, locking himself out in the cold. And he knew, with a certainty that was its own kind of hell, that he would spend the rest of eternity searching for a key he himself had destroyed. The town smelled of salt, wet cobblestones, and decay. It was a forgotten place at the edge of the world, a dreary port where fog clung to the slate roofs like a shroud and the sea gnawed restlessly at the shore. Lucian had come here following the faintest pull, the phantom sensation of the bond drawing him like a compass needle. It was the same feeling that had led him to a dozen other dead ends, but he couldn't ignore it. He was a ghost haunting his own failure, drawn to the quiet, forgotten corners of the world because they mirrored the landscape of his own heart. He was tired. A deep, soul-crushing weariness had settled into his bones over the last year, a fatigue that even his vampiric nature could not overcome. He found himself standing outside a small, cluttered bookshop, the windows steamy against the perpetual drizzle. The sign above the door, painted in faded gold leaf, read The Crooked Shelf. He pushed the door open, a small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerless jingle. The air inside was thick with the beloved, familiar scent of aging paper and leather binding. It was a scent that was inextricably linked with her, and for a moment the ache in his chest sharpened so intensely it made him catch his breath. He moved through the narrow aisles, his ragged traveling cloak dripping onto the worn floorboards, not looking for anything in particular. These places were his penance, his self-inflicted torture. And then he caught it. Beneath the dominant notes of paper and dust, there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible fragrance. It was the scent of her, not the full, distinctive vampiric signature that the charm would have masked completely, but something far more subtle. The scent of lavender and old parchment that clung to her clothes, the particular combination that was uniquely hers. He froze, his head snapping up. It was so faint he thought he might be imagining it, his grief-addled mind conjuring ghosts from the air. But then he caught it again, a little stronger this time, drifting from the street outside. His weariness vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it felt like a physical blow. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation, hammered in his veins. He turned and strode out of the shop, his senses on high alert, casting about like a wolf on the scent. The rain had picked up, and the smell was being washed from the air, but he had the trail. He followed it, his long strides eating up the slick, cobbled street. It was a tense, silent hunt, a desperate prayer taking shape with every step. The scent led him away from the main thoroughfare, down a winding alley, and into a small, quiet square. It was there, across the square, that he saw it. A small bakery, its windows glowing with a warm, buttery light that was a stark contrast to the gray misery of the day. The sign read, "The Rolling Pin." The scent was strongest here, mingling with the rich aroma of baking bread and cinnamon. And through the large front window, he saw her. The world stopped. Time, sound, the rain on his face, it all ceased to exist. There was only her. Her hair was tied back in a simple knot, and a smudge of flour graced her pale cheek like a pale kiss. She was wearing a simple linen apron over a dark dress, and she was kneading dough on a flowered countertop, her movements efficient and focused. She was living a small, quiet, profoundly mortal life. She looked not happy, but at peace. A fragile, carefully constructed peace, but peace nonetheless. A peace he had shattered. The sight of her, alive and whole and so impossibly, achingly real, buckled his knees. He gripped a nearby iron railing to keep from falling. A year of searching, of despair, of living in a gray, hollowed-out world, and it all culminated in this quiet, miraculous vision of her through a rain-streaked window. The relief was so absolute it was agonizing, a physical pressure in his chest that threatened to shatter his ribs, but right behind it, treading on its heels, was a tidal wave of terror. She was here. He had found her. And now, he had to face her. Now, he had to find the words to undo the damage of a single, catastrophic sentence, knowing full well that such words might not exist. He didn't rush in. He just stood in the rain, a king reduced to a shivering penitent, watching the woman who was the center of his universe, terrified that she had built a new one entirely without him. He waited. He stood in the deepening twilight, a statue carved from shadow and regret, until the warm light in the bakery was extinguished and the lock on the front door clicked shut. He watched her pull a heavy shawl around her shoulders and step out into the damp evening air. She didn't see him at first, her attention focused on securing the door behind her. He let her take 2 steps into the empty square before he spoke. Sira. Just her name. It was not a king's command, but a beggar's plea. It was a year of anguish, distilled into a single word. She froze, her back to him. He saw every muscle in her body go rigid. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she turned. Her face was pale in the gloom, her eyes wide. The fragile peace he had observed through the window was gone, shattered. In its place was a maelstrom of emotions that washed over her features in a devastating sequence. Shock, then fear, then a deep, resonant anger. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers instinctively closing over the hidden charm that kept him at bay. It was a gesture of self-defense, and it cut him more deeply than any blade. He took a tentative step forward, his hands held open at his sides, a gesture of surrender. "Please," he said, his voice raw. "Don't run. Just let me speak. Let me explain." She didn't move, her eyes narrowed, her body coiled like a spring. "Explain what?" Her voice was cold, brittle. "You were perfectly clear. You wanted friendship. I declined the offer. There is nothing more to say." "No," he said, the word torn from him. He took another step. "No, I was a coward. I was a fool. Everything I said was wrong." He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the lonely darkness of the past year, and now the words came tumbling out, clumsy and desperate. "When I realized what you were to me, I panicked. I was terrified. It wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about them, my parents." He saw a flicker of confusion in her guarded expression. He pressed on, laying his soul bare in the middle of the rain-slicked square. "My parents had the same bond, Sarah, and it destroyed them. It was a weapon, a prison. Their love was a sickness, a possessive, violent thing that burned their world to the ground. I grew up in the ashes of that fire. I swore I would never let that happen. And then I looked at you, and I felt it. And all I could see was that cage closing around you. I was so afraid of becoming my father that I couldn't see anything else." He was closer now, close enough to see the rain clinging to her lashes. "When I said friends, God, it was the stupidest, most cowardly thing I have ever said in my entire long life." His voice broke. "What I was trying to say, what I didn't have the courage to say, was, I love you, and it terrifies me. I thought if we could build something slower, a foundation of friendship and trust, that we could control the bond, that it wouldn't control us. I was trying to protect you. From it. From me." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them, raw and exposed. He had offered her the truth, the whole, ugly, pathetic truth of his fear. He watched her face, searching for any sign of softening, any crack in the wall of her anger. Sarah listened, her expression unreadable. The anger was still there, but beneath it, something else stirred. The story he told, it had the painful, messy ring of truth. But a year was a long time. A year was long enough to build a fortress around a broken heart. She had survived. She had rebuilt a life from the wreckage he had left behind. She could not, would not, let him tear it down again on the basis of a single, desperate speech. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm, each word carefully chosen. "You have had a year to craft that explanation, Lucien." The use of his name was a deliberate, formal distancing. "I have had a year to live with the one you gave me. I need time." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured, leaving him alone in the growing dark, the rain washing over him like a merciless baptism. He had said the words. He had offered the truth. But he knew, as he watched her disappear into the fog, that the real penance was only just beginning. He did not follow her. The urge to do so was a physical clawing in his gut, a primal scream from the bond, however muted, to close the distance. But he fought it down. He had learned the devastating cost of his own impatience. She had asked for time and space, and he would give her an eternity of both if she required it. He found a small, grim apartment for rent on the second floor of a building that overlooked the square, its windows facing her bakery. It would be his monastery, his watchtower. The next morning, before the first hint of dawn, he wrote the first letter. He poured onto the page everything he had failed to say the night before, and more. He wrote not just of his parents' bond, but of specific moments, the sound of his mother's weeping through a thick oak door, the sight of his father's knuckles, white as he gripped a chair to keep from throwing it. He wrote of his own lonely childhood, a boy prince wandering a palace that echoed with beautiful, violent misery. He didn't write it for pity, but for context, for understanding. He folded the heavy parchment, sealed it with plain wax, and left it on the doorstep of the bakery, propped against the door. Then he retreated to his window and waited. He saw her arrive, a silhouette in the gray morning mist. He saw her stop, her gaze falling on the letter. She hesitated for a long moment, her posture stiff with suspicion. He held his breath. He watched as she finally bent down, picked it up, and took it inside without opening it. It was not a victory, but it was not a rejection. It was enough. This became their new, strange ritual. Every morning, he would write. And every morning, a letter would be waiting for her. He wrote about the 3 months they'd shared, reliving each moment from his perspective. Do you remember the afternoon you found the flaw in the Mercator projection? I had never seen anyone so delighted by an error. I think I fell in love with you a little bit right then. He wrote about the year of searching. I went to a city in the southern desert, a place of sun-baked stone. I thought I saw you in the market, and my heart stopped. It was not you. My heart has stopped 1,000 times this year. It is a wonder I am still walking. The letters were raw, unfiltered, stripped of all pride. They were his soul, pressed in ink and laid at her door. From Sira's perspective, the letters were an invasion, an unwelcome, daily reminder of a world she had tried to escape. She didn't read the first one for 2 days. It sat on her small kitchen table, a silent accusation. But its presence wore on her, and finally, her curiosity, or perhaps some deeper, more wounded part of her, won out. She read it. And the one after that, and the one after that. She read them with her walls up, with a cynical, protective part of her brain searching for manipulation, for the flowery lies of a king used to getting his way. But the lies never came. The words were simple, direct, and freighted with a pain that felt as real as her own. He was giving her the missing pieces, the context for his cruelty. It didn't excuse it, but it began, slowly, to explain it. Weeks turned into a month. He never approached her. He never spoke to her. He was just there. A constant, silent presence across the square. A shadow in a window. A letter on a doorstep. One morning, as she was setting out the day's bread, she found herself making an extra cup of strong, black coffee, the way he used to take it. On impulse, she left it on the bakery's outdoor sill, a few feet from where he always left the letter. There was no note. It was just a cup of coffee. From his window, Lucian saw it. He watched for a long time after she had gone back inside. Then, he descended the stairs and walked across the square. He picked up the letter she had not yet taken and replaced it with the still warm cup. He took a sip. The bitter, hot liquid was the most hopeful thing he had tasted in a year. He looked up at the bakery window, though he could not see her, and for the first time since she had vanished, a genuine, aching smile touched his lips. The silence between them had once again begun to speak. The seasons turned. Summer's humid grip gave way to the crisp, melancholic air of autumn. The daily ritual of letter and coffee had become the bedrock of their strange, silent relationship. Through his letters, Sarah had learned the intimate architecture of his regrets. She knew the names of the constellations he watched from his window at night. She knew he was relearning how to rule, sending missives back to his council, his commands tempered by a new, hard-won humility. He was rebuilding his kingdom from afar, just as she was rebuilding her life. He was patient. He was constant. And a dangerous, tender part of her was beginning to believe him. The turning point came on a moonless night in late October. A trio of nomadic vampires, young, arrogant, and radiating a casual cruelty, had drifted into the port town. They carried themselves with the swagger of predators in a field of sheep, and their eyes had fallen on Sarah. They saw a solitary woman, seemingly unprotected, and marked her as sport. She had been aware of their predatory gazes for days, a prickling on the back of her neck that kept her on edge. That night, they cornered her as she was locking up the bakery. They blocked her path in the narrow alley beside the shop, their smiles wide and full of teeth. Leaving so soon? The leader drawled, stepping into her space. The night is just beginning. Sarah stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not helpless, but she was 1 against 3, and they were spoiling for a fight. "I have no business with you," she said, her voice even, betraying none of the fear coiling in her stomach. "We can think of some," another one chuckled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. And then, he was there, Lucian. He didn't emerge from the shadows. He seemed to coalesce out of them, a figure of absolute stillness at the mouth of the alley. He hadn't moved quickly. He hadn't made a sound. He was simply present. He was still dressed in the simple, dark clothing he'd worn for months, but in that moment, there was no mistaking him. The sheer, crushing weight of his age and power radiated from him, a palpable force that sucked the air and warmth from the alley. He said nothing. He simply looked at them. His eyes, fixed on the leader, were not angry. They were utterly empty, a flat, final blackness that promised nothing but swift and silent annihilation. It was the gaze of a being for whom their entire existence was a momentary inconvenience, easily erased. The arrogant smiles on the young vampires' faces faltered, then melted away, replaced by a primal, instinctive fear. They recognized what he was. They were looking at an apex predator, an ancient power they could not begin to comprehend. The leader swallowed, taking an involuntary step back. "No trouble here," he managed to stammer, raising his hands in a gesture of placation. "Just leaving." They practically scrambled over each other to get away, melting back into the darkness of the town, their bravado gone. They vanished. Lucian remained where he was, his gaze following them until they were gone. Only then did the terrifying stillness recede, replaced by a fierce, controlled concern. He turned his eyes to Sarah, and she saw the fury that he had kept leashed, a terrifying storm held back behind his calm facade. He didn't move toward her, he didn't try to touch her. He just stood there, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, tight with a rage that was entirely on her behalf. And in that moment, everything shifted. She looked at him, at the raw, protective power he held in such careful check, and she understood. This was not the possessive, controlling rage of his father's stories. This was not about ownership. This was a shield. This was a quiet, terrifying strength he had wielded, not to dominate her, but to protect her. He had let them see the king the monster so they would never threaten her again. It was the most profound declaration he had yet made, spoken without a single word of love. The fortress around her heart didn't just crack, a whole section of the wall crumbled to dust. She saw the man who had written her 100 letters, who had watched over her from a lonely window, who had just faced down a threat to her safety with the cold, final power of a god. She took a slow breath, the fear finally leaving her. "Yes," she said, her voice softer than it had been in a year. "I'm all right." She met his gaze across the short distance, and for the first time, she let him see past the anger and the pain to the woman who had once loved him. "Thank you, Lucian." The night of the confrontation in the alley changed the texture of the silence between them. The next morning, there was no letter on her doorstep. Instead, as she opened the shop, she saw him standing across the square, waiting. He wasn't looking at his window, but at her. It was a clear, silent question. Taking a deep breath, she picked up 2 mugs and the pot of fresh coffee, walked out of her bakery, and crossed the square toward him. He met her halfway. She handed him a mug, and he took it, his fingers brushing hers. The brief touch was a spark in the cold morning air. They didn't speak at first, just stood in the middle of the empty square, sipping their coffee as the town slowly woke around them. The silence was no longer tense or freighted with unspoken history. It was comfortable, companionable. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he finally said, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his mug. "The part of me that is, like my father." "I didn't see your father," she replied quietly. "I saw a man protecting someone. There's a difference." He looked at her then, and the gratitude and relief in his eyes were so profound it made her heart ache. They talked for an hour, leaning against the cold stone of the central fountain. They didn't talk about the bond, or the past year, or the chasm between them. They talked about the town. She told him about Mrs. Gable, who always bought a seeded loaf on Tuesdays, and about the fisherman who came in at dawn for sweet rolls. He told her about the book he was reading, a dense history of forgotten trade routes. They were learning each other again, not as fated mates, but as 2 people sharing a coffee on a crisp autumn morning. It was simple, it was real. When it was time for her to open the shop properly, she hesitated. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, the invitation quiet but monumental. He nodded, a small, grateful dip of his head. She led him not into the front of the shop, but to the small, cozy apartment she had above it. It was a simple space, filled with books and the lingering scent of baking. He stood in the center of the room, looking around as if he were in a sacred place. He had imagined her life here, but to be in it, to see the worn armchair where she read and the stack of his letters on her mantelpiece, was overwhelming. His own apartment, when she finally asked to see it, was a stark contrast. It was a monk cell, a bed, a table, a chair. The only signs of life were the stacks of books and the truly astonishing number of papers on the table. She picked one up. It was a letter to her, dated from that very morning. It began, "Sarah, I don't know if I will ever have the courage to speak to you again, but I need you to know." She realized she was holding just one of hundreds. The evidence of his unwavering, year-long vigil was laid bare. He hadn't just been waiting. He had been actively hoping, actively speaking to her in the only way he could, pouring his heart out onto pages he never knew if she would see. The sight of it, the sheer, undeniable proof of his devotion, was the final blow to her defenses. She turned to face him. He was watching her, his expression vulnerable, his soul in his eyes. "I will wait forever, Sarah," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "If all I can ever be is your friend across the square, I will accept it. I have learned my lesson. The bond is a gift, not a right. Love is a choice, not a decree. I will never force it on you. I will never try to cage you." She looked at him, at this powerful, ancient king who had humbled himself completely, who had spent a year in penitent exile for her, and she believed him. The last shard of ice in her heart melted away. "I was afraid too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She reached up to the hollow of her throat, her fingers finding the cool, familiar shape of the lotus pendant. "I was so afraid of being something you only wanted because fate said you had to. I wanted to be chosen." His expression was one of pure anguish. "Oh, Sarah," he breathed. "You were always chosen. From the first moment, the bond just gave it a name." Her fingers worked at the small, intricate clasp. He had chosen her then, and he had chosen her every single day for the past year, with every letter, with every watchful hour. He had earned this. They had earned this. With a soft click, the clasp came undone. The silver charm, a symbol of her fear and her self-preservation, fell into her waiting palm. The effect was not subtle. It was a detonation. The moment the silver charm left her skin, the world fractured. It was not a gentle reconnection, but a dam bursting, a tidal wave of sensation and emotion that had been held back for more than a year, now crashing down upon them both with overwhelming force. For Lucian, it was like breathing after a year of being held underwater. The dull, phantom ache in his chest, the constant, agonizing reminder of his loss, was obliterated by a blinding, life-giving sun. Her soul, vibrant and complex and so achingly familiar, slammed into his. It wasn't just her presence, it was her. He felt the quiet strength she had cultivated in her solitude, the deep well of her compassion, the lingering sorrow that was a testament to the wound he had inflicted. He felt her shock, her fear, and then, beneath it all, a cautious, burgeoning hope that mirrored his own. The golden thread between them was no longer a thread. It was a conduit, a river of light pouring her essence directly into his heart. He stumbled back a step, bracing himself against her table, gasping as a year of sensory deprivation ended in a single, cataclysmic instant. For Sarah, the experience was just as profound. The hollow space within her, the void she had carried since that cold night of her departure, was suddenly, completely filled. His soul rushed in, not as an invasion, but as a homecoming. She felt the staggering depth of his love for her, a force of nature as powerful and ancient as he was. But it was not the terrifying, possessive thing she had feared. It was tender. It was reverent. It was steeped in a regret so vast and genuine it brought tears to her eyes. She felt his year of torment as if it were her own, the frantic searching, the gnawing despair, the monastic, lonely vigil he had kept. She felt his unwavering certainty that she was, and always would be, the only one for him. All the words in his letters were true. She could feel the truth of them now, resonating in the deepest parts of her being. She understood, in that moment, that his suffering had been as deep, if not deeper, than her own. They stared at each other across the small room, both breathless, both shaken to their core. There were no more words. There was no need for them. The bond sang between them, a perfect, harmonious chord that communicated everything. All the apologies, all the explanations, all the fear, and all the hope, it was all there, a shared truth that was as clear and undeniable as the light of day. Slowly, he pushed himself off the table and moved toward her. Each step was deliberate, a question. He stopped just before her, his hands still at his sides, giving her every opportunity to retreat. He would not presume, he would not take, he would only accept what she was willing to give. Sarah looked up into his face, seeing him clearly for the first time in over a year. She saw the ancient king, the powerful protector, and the lonely man who had been terrified of his own heart. She saw his love, and she saw her own reflected in his eyes. Her hand, the one holding the now inert silver charm, opened, and the pendant fell to the floor with a soft, metallic clink. Then, she raised her hands, and gently, tentatively, cupped his face. His skin was cool, like marble, but a tremor ran through him at her touch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her palms as if he were a dying man, and she was life itself. It was not a passionate gesture, but one of profound, bone-deep relief. It was reverence. It was surrender. He brought his own hands up to cover hers, holding them against his face. His thumbs gently stroked the backs of her hands. It was the first time they had truly touched in a year, and it was an anchor in the overwhelming sea of the newly restored bond. They stood like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together, simply breathing each other in, relearning the contours of a connection they had both thought was lost forever. "I choose you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick against her skin. "Not because of fate, not because of a bond, because you are you. I choose you." "And I choose you, Lucien," she whispered back, the tears finally coming, hot and cleansing. "Forever, over fear." They left the small port town a week later, not for the grand capital but for nowhere in particular. They walked along a coastline, the sea on one side and the rest of their lives on the other. His kingdom could wait. They had a new world to build first, one founded not on destiny, but on a conscious, daily choice to love. The road ahead was unknown, but they walked it together, hand in hand, the golden resonance of their souls, a quiet, steady song against the rhythm of the waves. It was not an ending, it was the beginning of their true story.